Alrighty, well, let's get going. Merce, next slide.
All right, there.
Okay. Well, here are the topics for today. I want to just mention that there are three main ones. We're going to be talking about time, wisdom in the liberal arts, and interpreting scripture, the Bible. The objectives I have for this and for all of these talks is, one, to provide some context. Two, and this one's very important to me, to identify connections between what we see at Chartres Cathedral and what we might see here in North America. And three, respond to questions. I'll take a moment at this point to just offer a couple disclaimers and things. One, we're going to be talking about time and its connection with astronomy. I'm not an astronomer. Just want to put it out there. There are some folks on here who are. Rick Legault among them knows a heck of a lot about astronomy and medieval astronomy, and I'm going to be relying some on the work that he's done here as we talk about it. Secondly, I'm not an art historian. You know, for those of you who don't know me, I'm interested in these topics and have been for a long time. But my background is in Medicare law, so go figure. And I'm not a theologian. I thought about becoming a minister at one point in my life, but decided to go a different route. But long and short of it is that these three topics have been a real source of curiosity for me for most of my adult life. And particularly at Chartres Cathedral, it's kind of fun to see because one of my interests in Gothic cathedrals and medieval history and what have you is really because I'm curious about, and really as a Lutheran, someone who was raised in a church that was very much Reformation oriented and Protestant, and looking at things from the time of Martin Luther and onward. I've been very interested in what Martin Luther and the other reformers were reacting against. And Chartres Cathedral has been for me a bit of a focal point in helping to understand some of the history that came before the Protestant Reformation and in some cases led to it. Then a couple other things. I just want to say that this is all about appreciation for Chartres Cathedral and what's gone into it and what's there. I'm not by any means trying to proselytize or advance or promote any particular belief system, including Christianity. I'm really here to promote appreciation for this amazing building and its amazing art, the stained glass, the sculpture, and help understand what's there, to appreciate. And I really hope, if you've not been there, that you get a chance to do it, to visit this wonderful place. I should also mention one thing that I wish I had said the last time around. There are some things here, and even in a three-part introduction to Chartres Cathedral, and we're going to be spending a fair amount of time, about 3 hours total, looking at this place. There are a lot of things that are going missing in my introduction to Chartres. One of them is a world-famous labyrinth. It's been this amazing labyrinth, which is really almost right at the entrance as you go into the cathedral. It's been a model for labyrinths throughout the world, including a big one in Boston downtown and some in other cities. So at any rate, that's one of the things that we're not going to be getting into. Other things, we're not going to be talking about building techniques. There's some folks who've written a whole heck of a lot about the materials and the technology that's behind building a cathedral. Wonderful stuff. I recommend those books to you. And if you have interest in those things, by all means, chat or email me, and I can at least offer some suggestions for things for you to read. We're not going to be talking so much about sacred geometry, the cult of Mary, the Chartres Cathedral School, which is a topic that we could probably take an hour talking about just in itself, and not so much about the lives of saints. All of that is there at Chartres Cathedral, but we're focusing on some other things that are, of interest to me here. So this is a very selective and personalized tour, that's for darn sure. Okay, Merce, let's continue. So for those of you who weren't with us last time and want a little orientation, where is Chartres? As the crow flies, it's about 48 miles southwest of Paris. It's on a regional train line that will get you there in about an hour or an hour and 15 minutes at the most. It's a city, a smallish city that's in the middle of a wheat growing area called the Beauce. Next slide, Merce. So a little welcome to Chartres. There you have the train station, pulled in there quite a few times. To the right of the train station, there's a bistro called Les Serpents, the Serpent, where they serve very good cold beer in 0.25 milliliter glasses, and wine, of course, in France, along with some good food, tea, what have you. It's a wonderful place to sit. Below to the left is another patisserie boulangerie called Saint Honoré, named for Saint Honorius. Wonderful place that Rick and I visited a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, as a matter of fact. I've got a slide coming up about that in a bit. And then just to point out that Chartres is, on the weekends, a very lively place. I really have enjoyed just sitting there, eating, drinking, what have you. And you see a little bit of it there. It's a wonderful place to visit. Next one. There's the cathedral. That's the site you see walking up from the train station. It takes about 5 to 10 minutes to get there. 5 if you walk quickly, 10 if you're a little bit slower like I am these days. But it really dominates the city on a hilltop overlooking in many directions. Great view from those towers, I might add. All right, let's move on. Okay, here's a little historical context for today's talk. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time dwelling here. In 1194, there was a fire that destroyed most of Chartres Cathedral. They were able to reuse some of it, the front part of it, the west facade, and we'll look at that as we get into the talk today. 1199, Europeans used compasses for the first time. In 1200, the University of Paris was chartered by the King of France at the time, Philip II. It's important to note that there was a shift in learning and teaching around this time. Up until 1200, the cathedrals had schools that were very influential in terms of passing on the knowledge that existed at the day. Chartres had one of the most famous cathedral schools in Europe at the time, and many scholars came from all over France, Germany, and elsewhere, England, to that school. But around this time, the universities were becoming established. There were some in Italy already by 1200. Others in England followed within the next 10 years, Cambridge and Oxford among them. But at any rate, the University of Paris became the most famous and was really one of the biggest draws for students from throughout Europe. And its philosophers, its scholars became quite famous. You might have heard, this is one of the things I learned as I was doing a little research on the University of Paris. A lot of people, and I'm among them, thought it was called the Sorbonne. And the Sorbonne takes its name from the School of Theology that was established at the University of Paris about 20 or 30 years after the school itself was chartered. So it was named for, let's see the guy's name, Robert de Sorbonne, and it got its name in 1257. couple other things that I want to mention here is that in 1202, a mathematician named Fibonacci, an Italian, published a book called the Liber Abaci, the Book of the Abacus. The abacus was a accounting device that started to incorporate the numeric system that came from India and the Arabs around the numbers 1 through 10, including 0. A monk who became Pope Sylvester II around the year 1000 was actually the guy who probably, we believe, was the guy who introduced that abacus. And it's not the kind that you'd think about with China. It used counters, little pieces to designate numbers 1 through 10, and then numbers 100 and beyond, and the thousands and so forth. So it was really the introduction of base 10 mathematics back in the year 1000 through that pope when he was still a monk. Fibonacci took it to the next step about 200 years later. Fibonacci took that whole mathematical system that we now are quite comfortable with. Before that, people were counting in Roman numerals and had various devices or procedures for counting that were difficult. Fibonacci took it to a level in which he used those Hindu Arabic numbers, the Arabic numerals that we're used to, 1 through 10, and made them relevant for bookkeeping, for commercial transactions, and so forth. So from that point forward, 1 through 10 and 100 through 1,000 and million and all of that began to take off as an aspect of commercial transactions in Europe. So that Liber Abaci, even though it wasn't necessarily about the abacus so much, was a very instrumental book in terms of taking us to the next level in mathematical and scientific research. In 1210, there was something called the condemnation. And we're going to talk a little bit more about Aristotle as we get into this. But the condemnation of 1210 was a reaction by church officials to the introduction of Aristotelian teaching in the University of Paris. And one writer says basically this: because some of Aristotle's newly translated views, and at the time they were in the midst of translating Aristotle from Greek and Arabic into Latin, it had been lost. A lot of Aristotle's works, particularly on, they called it natural philosophy, but basically it meant biology and zoology and so forth. A lot of that had been lost for almost 1,000 years, and was then at the time being translated, and it was a big revelation to a lot of scholars, just some of the things that he was saying. But some of the church people reacted to it because Aristotle's, I'll read this, newly translated views discounted the notions of a personal God, immortal soul, or creation. So they were inclined to censor some of those views. The University of Paris in particular was singled out for restrictions on the teaching of Aristotle at the time. So by 1250, all of the translation of Aristotle was complete. And then right before Chartres Cathedral was dedicated in 1260, Marco Polo was born in Venice. And, in time would be traveling off to China and making connections there. So the long and short of it is this is a very fertile time in the intellectual history of Europe as this cathedral was being built. Essentially from 1194 to about 1240, 1260 when it was actually dedicated. And Cora, there was a question I saw from Hillary about who was going to the University of Paris. From Hillary, I think Hillary mainly it was men, it was churchmen, and the nobility and aristocracy going to the schools there. as far as I know, women were sometimes being taught by tutors and others in their homes, but at this stage of the game, the university was pretty much a male-dominated environment. All right, we're going to be talking about time now, and one of the things that Chartres Cathedral does a good job of, and it's really kind of cute in a lot of ways, is to illustrate things we've read or seen in the Bible in some very charming ways, and this is one of them. What you see here is the creation of day and night. Over on the left, there's God, who looks a lot like Jesus. And for those of you who aren't Christian, one of the reasons he looks like Jesus is because in the Gospel of John, there's this notion that Jesus was with God at the beginning of time and was God and is God. So in Christian sculpture and stained glass, you will often see God represented by Jesus because of that connection with the Gospel of John and the idea that Jesus was there as the Word with God at the beginning of time, well, at the beginning of time and even before. What you have here is a slightly tired out after the first day God, after creating night and day. Night and day represented by, on the left, a female figure blindfolded. She can't see, so it's dark for her. And her counterpart, male figure, leading her by the hand, day. So that's how at least the Chartrians, the folks at Chartres in the 12th, 13th century, represented the creation of day and night. That's the first day. With the first day, Merce, let's move on here, came the creation of time. It's not said there in the book of Genesis, God created time, but it follows that having created day and night and a day, we have now the creation of time. My friend Rick writes about the creation of time, or time itself, as an artifact, something that God created. It wasn't there before creation. Eternity was beyond time, God beyond time. But with creation, we have time. So for the medieval Christians and for medieval Muslims and Jews, it was important to calculate time accurately to set feast days. Easter, the Ramadan for the Muslims, Passover for Jewish people. And there was a lot of effort that went into this. Again, I'm not an astronomer. I don't know all of the ins and outs of how this happened and what they did to calculate time, but know that it's a big deal for them, and that big deal is very much represented in the sculpture in stained glass at Chartres. The other thing that was important was setting the hours for prayer during the day. The monks and the people who serve the church there at Chartres would pray at various times of the day, including through the night. And this was called the divine office, or services, the divine services during the day. And basically it started at midnight. They got up again at 3 a.m., 6 a.m., 9 a.m. for prayers during the day, mass during the day, all of it timed according to these 8 divisions of prayer time during the day. Very important for them to set those times accurately. How did they keep track of it at night? It was a little bit difficult. They had some things they could do. They had some tools, but we're going to talk about that in a little bit too, because some of them had some pretty interesting and kind of curious ways of doing it. The other thing that we're going to be talking about in connection with time are what are now known as labors of the month. And these are, in art, in medieval art, common scenes of agricultural and festive activities that went on in any given month. and they use them to identify the months in stained glass and sculpture. The other thing they used were zodiac signs, and an important thing to note that at the time, astronomy and astrology, predictions and so forth, were very much linked in the minds of medieval astronomers, that the two kind of went together. They saw and they looked for links between the heaven and earth, predictive links and so forth. Not entirely like horoscopes today, but pretty similar. Next slide, Merce. All right. What you have at Chartres Cathedral are representations of linear time, the idea that time has a beginning and an end, and cyclic or circular time, that is the seasons, the cycles of the seasons. And one of the ways that medieval Christians and Christians ever since have expressed the notion of linear time is with the idea of the Alpha and Omega, the two Greek letters that begin and end the Greek alphabet. In the book of Revelation, in the New Testament, Christ is referred to 3 times as the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and end. And here at Chartres, you have at least 3 representations of Christ at the end of time as the Alpha. You see there on the left here, probably the best of the photos, with the Alpha here and the Omega here. Here again, higher up in the cathedral in one of the clear story windows, Alpha and Omega. And then pretty much opposite this window, you have this one high up above where the Alpha and Omega are inverted. You have Omega on this side, Alpha on this side. And in my next talk, I'm going to be offering a little theory about what's going on with that. It's all theoretical, speculative on my part, but I think you might find it interesting about why there's an inversion there. Next slide. So the idea of linear time is also portrayed in what's called the royal portal, the 3 main doorways on the west facade of Chartres Cathedral. Here you have them down here. Cora and I are looking at them here. Next slide. We're going to go from left to right. And I'd like to mention at this point that some things about Chartres Cathedral aren't entirely known or known well. We don't know exactly what some of the design or the donors or designers intended. And this doorway, the left one in the series of 3, is one of those places where there's still some controversy or at least disagreement about what's being represented here. Some folks say that this is an image of Christ's ascension. You see clouds below and it looks like angels are there kind of lifting. An alternate theory is that this is actually the whirlwind that is mentioned in the book of Job, where God is talking about creation to Job. And it's a theory that my friend Mike Klug has written about, and some others have too. It's consistent with the idea of a representation of linear time, and also with a verse in the book of Wisdom that pretty much sets up the sequence, that there's a beginning, an end, and a middle. So, Merce, we're gonna, I'll mention a couple other things about this one. And that is the other thing that's really playing into the idea that this is a creation scene, or it has to do with creation, are the zodiac signs and labors of month around it. That this is God at the center of time in one sense. All right, let's move on. So that center doorway represents an apocalypse verse, or verses in the apocalypse in the book of Revelation, where you have Christ in majesty in the middle, seated on a throne. So there's a throne image there in the book of Revelation. Well described throne. And around Christ on the throne are four figures, four beasts, as they sometimes call them. The technical term for those four beasts is the tetramorph, four beings. And they represent a whole bunch of things. This is where Christian iconography really takes on some interesting aspects, and that it's many layered. For one thing, those four beasts represent for the gospel writers. On the bottom left, you see a lion representing the gospel writer Mark. On the right, a bull, winged bull representing the gospel writer Luke. Top left, a winged man or an angel of sorts representing the gospel writer Matthew. And then off to the right, an eagle representing the gospel of John. And theologians along the way have interpreted that to mean, for instance, that the lion represents Christ as the Lion of Judah. The bull represents the idea that Christ was a sacrifice. The man represents Christ as both God and man, and also a reasoning being. And the eagle representing the Gospel of John for its ability to soar to the heavens with us. So at any rate, there's a lot of interpretation that goes on for those four symbols. But where do they really come from? Well, they're mentioned in the book of Revelation, but they go even further back to the Hebrew Bible and Ezekiel, one of the prophets, who writes about these same four beasts in a vision of the heavens. They probably go even further back than that. Ezekiel was writing during the Babylonian captivity for the Jewish people. So he was exposed to a whole lot of Assyrian and Babylonian art and other writings. And it appears from what scholars have come up with is that these four images were actually four of the cardinal point, or represent the four cardinal points in the Babylonian zodiac. So a lot of connections here again with time, with the sky, with God at the center of time. Moving on. The third doorway is dedicated to Christ's incarnation, to his embodiment, and it's also called a seat of wisdom for Mary and the image of Mary and Jesus up here. But let's take a little bit of a look at what's going on. And again, remember, this is linear time, beginning and middle. Here's the middle part for Christians. Christ's birth, arrival on the planet is a pivotal moment dividing Old Testament from New Testament. And that becomes an important thing for us as we look at biblical interpretation a little bit later on. But this is an incarnation scene below. These lintels, the lintels are going across here horizontally. You have over here an image of the angel talking or speaking to Mary. This is Gabriel announcing to Mary that she's going to have a child. The next figures are Mary and her cousin Elizabeth. Then the nativity itself, Mary on a bed below, Jesus on what looks like an altar above. This harkens back to our first talk about how this altar image for Jesus is consistent with the church's belief that Jesus's real presence is there, Christ's real presence is there in the sacrament of the Eucharist, the body and blood, the bread and wine, sorry to say. Over here are the shepherds listening to an angel. Up above is the presentation of Jesus in the temple. And then above that, an image of Mary and Jesus called the Sedis Sapientiae, or the seat of wisdom. And we'll come back to this notion when we get into the stuff about the liberal arts in a bit. Okay, let's move on, Merce. And now we're going to move kind of quickly to talk about how cyclical time or circular time shows up at Chartres Cathedral. And again, here's that west, or I'm sorry, the leftmost of the portals with some of the zodiac and labor of month figures up above. Let's move on. Okay, so here you have Leo and Taurus representing 2 of the months, and then down below, and I should mention that the medieval folks represented or used the zodiac signs to represent specific months, so that Taurus, unlike today, represented April in many of the images there. Leo a little bit later, I think June or July. But what you have below are so-called labors of the month, these scenes that represent a specific time of year. And on the left, you've got a little guy there harvesting wheat, and he, I believe, represents August. On the right is a guy leading a horse with a falcon on top of the horse. You can see the bird up here. And he represents May, the jolly month of May, when they went out to do their hunting and chasing and all sorts of other wonderful things. And one of the things that they practiced in May was falconry, just getting the birds out there, the falcons, to do their hunting thing. So you'll sometimes see this, sometimes see other typical things going on in the month of May, but oftentimes it's these hunting and chasing scenes. Next one. Here's January on the left, represented by 2 faces. This isn't a labor necessarily, it's more of an allegorical kind of figure, in that in January you look, young guy, younger man, no beard, looking forward, and the older one with a beard looking back. It's that pivotal point in the year where you can look in both directions and hopefully see good things coming and good things behind. He's holding what I believe to be a bread or a king's cake with a knife or something to cut it. It's unclear, but in many images of January, you'll find what's called a king's cake being held by this 2-headed man. King's cake for the cake that's made on January 6th for the Three Kings Day. So there's a little festival notion going on with this one here. On the right, up above, is a representation, again, working at staying warm, like we're working at staying cool right now. In February, they would work to stay warm, and this guy is warming himself in front of a fireplace or hearth that you can see here up above. At one point, this would have been painted so that you'd see the flames in red and the guy's feet and all of that, and his nice little cloak in color. Down below are a couple more of the zodiac signs, Cancer and Aries. And over here on the right, a very cute little Scorpio with his tongue sticking out. It's probably the case that the French sculptors had never seen an actual scorpion, but these are things that circulated in manuscripts and other such things that they would have used as models. I asked my friend, since I have Cancer, how a zodiac sign came to be called Cancer. Well, a couple things to note. Cancer means crab in Latin. Aries means ram in Latin. Scorpio means scorpion in Latin. But how did crab come to mean cancer for us? My friend Chris Krenner, who's a medical historian in Kansas City, said that it's likely that it came from observations about breast cancer, that there would have been a crabbing effect visible as the disease progressed. And that may explain why you've got, these little legs going off and this connection being made between a crab and Cancer. Interesting, and if you want to learn more about it, I can send you in Chris's direction. Next one, Merce. All right, now we're going to look at the cycles of time in one of the windows toward the back of the church. It's called a calendar window, and that's where it is in what's called the ambulatory. They walked around the altar back there. Let's go. We're going to be looking at this window on the left. It's called a calendar window. You read it from bottom to top, pretty much left to right, and we'll take a look at some, not all of the images in it, but it'll give you a little sense of what's in there, and it's really quite beautiful. Okay, moving on. All right, here you see our friend with the multi-face on the left. Here's January in Aquarius. This one has 3 faces, back, present, and forward. Over on the right, an even more accurate, probably, image of February, some guy in February warming his feet. You see his bare feet here and bare hands and the big fire coming out of that hearth. Down below, Februs for February in Latin. Over here, Januarius for January in Latin. Okay, next one, Merce. Here's June making hay with a scythe on the left, Leo on the right. In other churches, you would see Leo representing July, not June. I'm not quite sure what the difference or how that comes to be, but there's somebody who's writing about it for the American Friends of Chartres, and I'm looking forward to her paper. All right, moving on. Virgo for August, a maiden representing the Virgin. And then we get into a couple of my favorite images from Chartres Cathedral and these labors of the month. Here you have September, where one guy, the one dressed in yellow, is gathering grapes while both of them are treading them in the big vat. That is a labor for the month of September. So here you do have an actual labor. It's not necessarily a festival. That comes later when they drink the wine. Moving on. At the end of the year, they butchered pigs for the festivals that were going to attending to Christmas and other such things. Here you see a butcher about to whack a pig's head. What's the pig doing? He's eating acorns. Here are the trees. Here are the acorns. Acorn-fed pigs, pork in Europe, is a real delicacy. When we were in Spain a few years ago, we tasted some. Tastes good, good ham, but you pay a premium for it for the feed that the pigs use. And there you see that poor pig about to lose his life. Anyhow, moving on. I want to mention one more thing about the zodiac, and that is that it had, and this isn't from Chartres, it's an image that comes from what's called a Book of Hours, and this was one of the most famous Book of Hours, which has prayers and a lot of other information in it. These were made for the nobility, and actually were made for a number of women who used them as prayer books, wives of the aristocrats and nobles, and daughters as well. But at any rate, one of the most famous books of hours is called the Très Riche, the Very Rich Hours of the Duke of Berry, who was related to the King of France at the time. This image is called a zodiacal, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, man. And making this connection between the stars and Earth again. Medicine was one place where it was very common and lasted for quite a while. And the idea here is that the different zodiac signs, the different planets, actually kind of govern different parts of the human body. And one of the ways that this played out for physicians in the Middle Ages is that they had to know astrology, in part to know when to operate and when to let blood. That there were better times of the year to actually drain the blood out of somebody to help promote their health. So physicians were well versed and learned astrology at their university. Moving on. And here, a connection. One of the things I'm very interested in are connections between the churches, cathedrals in Europe and the United States, and where you see the themes being played out. One of them is in the Redemptorist Church in Kansas City. This is a scene of Christ in majesty again. And here the zodiac shows up in the little signs you see here, not the crab and so forth, but the symbols for the crab. And from what I can tell, we have down here Aries. This is probably Taurus, though you can't make it out. Here's Gemini, Leo here, Scorpio, Sagittarius with the arrow over here, and Capricorn. It's the best I can make out of them, but they surround Christ along with these rainbow colors, again, getting at an apocalyptic image of Christ, modern one, probably from the early 20th century, at a church in the United States. So you don't see the zodiac in a lot of churches in the U.S., but you will find it, and it's just kind of fun to look for this stuff when you go into a church and start wandering and seeing what's there. Okay. I want to say a little bit about Rick Legault. Some of you heard him speaking a little bit earlier on. Rick Legault and I went to Chartres in 2019 in March. And we started out in England, came over on the ferry, took the old way across. We didn't do the Channel train. And we spent a few days at Chartres Cathedral. One, listening to Malcolm Miller, who I talked about in our last visit last month. Malcolm Miller, you're on the left here, is a longtime docent at Chartres Cathedral, quite famous and quite entertaining as a speaker and teacher. And we had the wonderful opportunity to have a private tour with him for about an hour. Over here on the right is Rick Legault in rapture with something called a Saint Honoré cake. It was his birthday, and this is his favorite birthday cake. And I can tell you it was quite an elaborate cake and very delicious, well worth the visit to at Saint Honoré Patisserie Boulangerie. But why do I have Rick Legault here? It's because I want to, as I did with our last talk, give credit to the people who really influenced my interest in Chartres Cathedral. Last time around, I spoke about Father McNamee, Malcolm Miller, and Merce as a real inspirer and instigator for me to get over there to do this stuff. Rick is somebody I met through my blog. He found me after I'd written about something, and he wrote to ask me about some angels and what I thought about some angels on the front of Chartres Cathedral. And we've had very good, mostly long distance by email communication since then, but we had that wonderful little more than a week together in England and France. So Rick knows or spotted, Merce, next slide, these angels in the center doorway at Chartres Cathedral. And you can see it best here on the right. This angel is holding a device in its left hand, circular, disc-like, and Rick asked me if I knew what they were. And I didn't. There are a lot of things that I've missed or overlooked at Chartres Cathedral. There's so much there. It's hard sometimes to see the trees and the forest together. You see a lot of the forest and you sometimes miss the trees. but Rick knew what they were. Let's move on. The angels are holding something called astrolabes. And in the Middle Ages, this device was becoming popular. It was reintroduced. This device started out in ancient Greece as a way to tell time, to measure the stars, the planet movements, all of that. It was an astronomer's best tool. It was lost to Western Europe for almost, or probably more than 1,000 years. It came back into Europe around the year 1000 through that Pope monk I mentioned before, Gerbert of Aurillac, who became Sylvester II. Astronomers used it to tell time, and importantly, they began to use it to tell time at night and to do so very accurately. One of the things that I read, and I'll share this because I think it's just kind of fun, is that before the astrolabe and some of these devices that were used to tell time, there was a lot of estimation going on. And one of the methods that was used to tell time at night, when you couldn't be quite sure, you didn't have clocks yet and all of that, was this way. The problem was that an hour of daytime was not 60 minutes, but 1/12 of the daylight hours. Night was 1/12 of the nighttime hours. Well, that really only works for 60 minutes on the days of the equinox. So Gregory of Tours, around the year 500, a churchman and scholar, came up with the idea that he needed to measure those hours on the spring and fall equinox when day and night were equal. So what he did during the day on those days was use a sundial to divide into 12. But what about at night? He used some instruments to do his best to come up with 1/12 of the night. But what happens then the rest of the year when the night gets shorter or longer and so forth? Well, Gregory came up with this notion that on those 2 days, with an accurate division of time, he would figure out how long it took to read a psalm or psalms during that 60-minute period. If it took 3 or 4 psalms, then he would have one of the monks read 3 or 4 psalms during that time period. And then at the end of the time period, the monk would ring a bell to wake everybody up so they would come out for their prayers at 3 in the morning. That bell in German is called a Glock. This idea that came from Gregory of Tours is sort of the original alarm clock. Glock, bell in German, became clock in English. So there's a connection between how we tell time, even before we had clocks, going back to Gregory of Tours and these systems that they devised to tell time during the night. But the astrolabe really enabled them to do it accurately from there on out. So what is an astrolabe? Merce, next slide. And maybe what we'll do, I know it's coming up on 7, maybe we should just end here rather than go into the rest of it. I can see what folks want to do. Did I have, maybe go to back, did the last slide say what is an astrolabe? Yeah, there we go. I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. One writer said it had more than 1,700 uses. You could tell time by the sun or stars in terms of 24-hour length of time. You could calculate the celestial coordinates of the moon and the sun and the planets. It helped predict eclipses and things of that sort. And it was used by astronomers and navigators really until the 16th, 17th century. It was a big use and a big deal. It was probably one of the most important instruments that astronomers had until the telescope. And one of the really weird things to come out of all of this is that a very famous medieval philosopher scholar named Peter Abelard, who lived in the late 1100s into the early 1200s, and was very much involved in this whole Aristotelian controversy. His story is a very tragic one in that he fell in love with a woman named Heloise, Abelard and Heloise, and she was much younger, one of his students. They eventually got married, but Abelard and Heloise had a child before they were married. That out of wedlock liaison led Heloise's uncle, with whom she lived, to really take it to Abelard in a bad way and castrated him. He lived that way. They married, but lived apart for the rest of their lives. But between them, they decided to name their child, their son, Astrolabe. So Peter Abelard, Heloise took this very important instrument and named their kid after it. One of the stranger things I've ever seen, but there you have it.